This video is sponsored by tester.co.uk. Hello YouTubers, and welcome to this part 2 in the series of how to solar power your home or your house. Now, in the last series we talked about the difference between grid-tied and off-grid installations. Now I want to move in and start talking about how we kind of understand the solar power requirement, then move into how we choose equipment and the cost and specific choices in solar panels. So for this video, what we're going to talk about is an important part which I think many people, when they talk about adding solar power to their homes or their houses, or even solar powering a shed out in their garden to do DIY, is understanding your power requirement and your power consumption. So power consumption is going to be an important part of this conversation, where I'm also going to go into specifically to talk about how you can save and economize on your power consumption in your house, whether it's to do with lighting, to do with heating, heating your water, or running your pool pump. I'm going to give you a few options for those bits and pieces. Now I'm going to add an annotation here to a video that I've done in an electronics series on power consumption. So if you are doing this yourself and you want to understand more about power consumption, do have a look at this video. We are going to go down onto the bench and have a look at some calculations, and hopefully they might make sense straight away, but that video will certainly add hopefully a lot more clarity to the topic. So let's talk about this whole concept of understanding your power requirement. Now, why it's so critical, as I said, is a lot of people come to me and they send emails and they say, right, I'm going to have so many solar panels on my roof. What size battery bank should I have and what size inverter? And you cannot understand those requirements until you've had a look at your own power consumption in your house to make those calculations in terms of what size solar array you need, what inverter, if you're going to use batteries as a backup, what size battery bank do you need? So the one good starting point is to obviously have your electricity bill to see how many kilowatt hours you use per month. The important thing to note about doing these calculations, and although I'm going to go through and show you what perhaps a typical house can use, that changes from month to month, week to week, year to year. There are going to be different times of the year when you are going to be heating or cooling your house, running your pool pump longer or shorter. Your fridge may have to work harder during summer than it does in winter. So all those do affect things. I'll also give you some idea of the pieces of equipment that you can use to go and make those individual measurements yourself. As I said, your utility bill or electricity bill is a good starting point. But ultimately you want to go and break down and understand what your geyser is using if you have a geyser that has an electrical element. You want to understand what your fridge is using, what your pool pump is using. And then once you've broken it down into those bits and pieces, you can start to see what the heavy power consumers are in your home. And those are the ones to target. And then understand, is it worthwhile spending the money on those? Now the thing to note is that when you make a saving on your own power consumption in your home, what you save on once off in your home, you potentially save 3 times on your solar power installation. It means you need a smaller solar array, you potentially need a smaller inverter, and if you have batteries, a smaller battery bank. So that's why it's critical to make those savings in your house if you can, and even spend money on your house on those savings, on more economical and eco-friendly appliances versus spending on your solar array. So I'm going to go in, we'll go to the bench, we'll look at some of those calculations. I'll then walk you through some of the pieces in my home as well, and then come back to the calculations to show you what those savings can do for you. Right, so let's get down and have a look at perhaps your typical home. Now, I say typical home, homes are so different in terms of the appliances and electrical bits and pieces inside them, and that changes from parts of the country to all around the world. But we'll look at a little simple home as an example. So here I've got a house, I've got a picture of a geyser, electrical geyser that's sat in the roof. It's obviously got some lighting, there's some entertainment in the form of a TV. Over here I happen to have in the kitchen, I've got a microwave oven and I've got a fridge. So a few basics of a house. Outside, this house happens to have a pool and it's also got a pool pump. So what we want to have a look at is the energy consumption of all these devices, and just to understand some of those fundamentals and what it can add up to, because this will form the basis of helping us decide on the equipment that we need and sizing the equipment or solar kit to go and power a house, or at least add to the power requirement of the house. Right, so if we go and list an item, now the things to note here are obviously all the items in your home will have a certain power rating. So the one thing is to understand that power rating. The next important thing to understand is the duty cycle, and here just to paint an example, your fridge, it'll have a power rating, and in fact it'll probably have two power ratings. It'll have a power rating when it's not actually doing its cooling. It's almost like an idle mode. And in this fridge I paint the example that when the actual pump is not pumping the refrigerant through the system, it's probably using about 30 watts. But when it is pumping the refrigerant and working, it's probably using 150 watts. But that has a duty cycle in terms of how long it runs for. Now depending, and this comes down to how well your fridge is insulated, how often people are opening the fridge door, the temperature, ambient temperature outside. But let's just say that for 30% of the day it's sitting idle, and for 70% of the day it's actually running and using that 150 watts. So that would be the duty cycle. So you need to understand that and multiply those figures in order to get a consumption for the day. That is why it's really important to understand these figures, and often even if you go and read them off the badges of your equipment, you won't exactly know the duty cycle, and often these power figures can be very different in reality. So that's why having measurement equipment to kind of do these audits is very helpful, and I'll show you some of these once we've gone through these calculations. So here we go, we've got our fridge. I'm saying it's got a duty cycle of 30% when it's almost kind of idle using 30 watts. So that's 7.2 hours times 30 watts plus 16.8 hours times 150 watts. So that works out to 216 watt hours plus 2,520 watt hours, which is a total of 2,736 watt hours. So as I said, if you want to understand this terminology, do refer to that video I pointed out in the beginning. If we go to an old style CRT television, now this would be a smaller television. I'm not talking about having like a 50-inch TV in your lounge, but a small old style CRT TV might consume 80 watts. If you're watching or have the television is on for 5 hours a day, that's the 5 hours times 80 watts. Will equate to 400 watt hours. If we got lights, and in this example I'm going to say you might have the older style incandescent light bulbs in your house with the filament, or downlighters, and here can be a big misnomer. Often those downlighters are sold as low voltage lights, and people think they're low voltage lights, so therefore they're using less power. Not. Those bulbs generally are 50 watt halogen bulbs, so they can consume a lot of energy, and it's quite scary to see the number of these people can have in their passages or their lounges. In this example, I'm just going to say we've got a lounge and we've got 5 of those 50 watt downlighters, so that equates to 250 watts. And if those are switched on for 7 hours a day, approximately 7 hours times the 250 watts would equate to 1,750 watt hours. Then we've got our geyser, And in South Africa, typically they are powered with an electrical element. I know in the States and perhaps the UK you may have gas-fired heating for your water. But certainly for those with an electric element, that element, even a medium-sized element, can consume about 3,000 watts. That could easily be on, depending on the insulation, and that's something we'll talk about. The insulation and the number of people in your household could be on for 4 hours a day. So 4 hours times 3,000 watts equates to 12,000 watt hours. So here already you're going to have the things which really jump out to you, which are heavy consumers, even in a very simple household. A pool pump. A typical pool pump for an average size pool, perhaps a smaller size pool, is about 750 watts. In summer, if that is running for, it could easily be running for 7 hours a day to do filtration and clean the pool if you've got a pool cleaner. So 7 hours times that 750 watts, that's 5,250 watt hours. Then let's say we've got a microwave. At this point in time, you might have a stove, you might have plates on your stove. These are just some examples of ways of cooking, and I've chosen a microwave. It runs at 1,200 watts. You might use it for half an hour to do your cooking, and that equates to 600 watt hours. So if we look at the grand total on that, that's 22,736 watt hours, but the more common breakdown of that in what you're being billed in is if we go to kilowatt hours. So then kilowatt is obviously 1,000, so that would be 22.7 kilowatt hours. Some of you on your utility bills, that might be just classed as 22.7 units of electricity, but that generally equates to kilowatt hours. So you can go and look at your utility bill once you've worked this out and see whether it actually ties up, and multiply this by your unit cost of your kilowatt hours to get a cost. But this is important because this, if you do want to solar power your house, if you want to solar power most of your house or run off the grid, unless you have an understanding of your consumption, you cannot size the equipment that you need to do it unless you go through this exercise. And as I said, this figure will change from summer to winter. To give you a rough idea, as it so happens, our household during summer, before I converted to solar power, would run on between 18 to 22 kilowatt hours per day in summer. That figure would move up to 28 to 32 kilowatt hours in winter. Obviously there's adjustments. I'd pull the time down on my pool pump, but then heating would increase. And of course, obviously the geyser would have to work harder in summer. So that's where those little offsets come between the seasons. Right, so let's go have a walk through my house and have a look at the different items in the house, and then we'll have a further chat about those. So there you go. So there's one example where you can potentially save a fair bit of money by changing your old fluorescent tubes into the LED type. And particularly if they are on for many hours, then the cost saving can be significant. But of course, there is an initial outlay for these, and you certainly want to make sure that you get the good quality tube so that you don't waste your money. Another thing to note, unlike normal fluorescent tubes which are throwing out light right around through 360 degrees, they're bouncing light off the roof, and that makes a big difference. These LED tubes, generally speaking, have an aluminium top part, so for 180 degrees on top, they don't reflect light. They're only throwing light down. So what I do is I actually angle mine out in the fittings. Now you have to do this carefully, because if you angle them out, they're going to fall out the slots. But I angle them out to throw light out to the sides so it's not wasted on a dark floor. And that's one consideration. Right, so that's one of the examples of the LED downlighters. Now, we've only got 4 downlighters in our lounge. They used to have 50-watt halogen globes in them. I've gone and replaced them with 6-watt globes. Now, they're sufficient for the lighting in our lounge and watching television. If you want to do any reading or what have you, what you might want to do is have a side light next to you so that you can read from that. Or you could put 10-watt LED downlighters in. Now, that's a saving from what I had, 4 times 50 being 200 watts, down to 24 watts. So that's fairly significant. The other thing to consider, in the mirror behind me, although it's a reflection, you'll see that kind of bright light over there. That's a skylight. Now, that is certainly a consideration. If you have dark places in your house and you happen to use lights during the day, putting in a skylight might be a considerable saving. I'll just give you a closer look. Again, things like bedside lights, one serious consideration is the CFL globes. You might have a standard 60-watt incandescent globe in there, and you can easily replace it with an 11-watt or even lower wattage CFL. The colors are getting better, so you can get far better kind of warm whites in terms of that, replacing that incandescent, the type of light warmth that comes from an incandescent globe. And also, they are almost instantly on in terms that they don't need time to warm up. But those are things to consider. Right, so I happen to be inside our walk-in closet in South Africa. Now, generally speaking, in South Africa, people don't have walk-in closets. They normally just have normal wardrobes. But in here, as you'll see behind me, there is a halogen downlighter. Now, in this case, I haven't replaced it with an LED downlighter because these are probably used for a maximum of 5 minutes a day. And at 5 minutes a day, for the cost of replacing it with an LED downlighter, it's just not going to pay for itself. And of course, if it blows, then it's an expensive replacement. But that's where you need to work out is the kind of duty cycle, the time that you have a light running. If it's running for 5, 6, 7 hours plus per day, you'll probably find it'll pay for itself in a year to 2 years. But if it's only a matter of minutes or half hour per day, you seriously have to do the sums to see if it's worth your while actually making that replacement. Right, so this is our variable speed pool pump. It's an e-pump or Flow Pro, and in South Africa it's branded Zodiac. I know in other parts of the world they have other names. It's literally just now, you can hear it's gone quiet. It's switching over to its slow mode. It goes through a prime. It primes itself. And now that it's completed priming itself, it's switched over to its slower RPM, its lower power run mode. And that I obviously specify on a clock with the controller for it, which I'll show you now. But what I wanted to just highlight is you can see on the actual plate over there with these specifications that it is rated for 1200 watts. But this will comfortably run the pool, the actual cleaner, at 250 watts now in its slow mode. So I kick it down to the slow mode for the latter part of the afternoon when I potentially know the solar power is going to start waning. But in the peak of the day, I have it running at higher RPM for better cleaning and better filtration. But let's have a look at the actual cleaner itself. So there we go, there's my pool cleaner. And as you'll note, it is comfortably ticking along, and my pool, as long as I clear out the leaves after it's been a little bit windy, is kept perfectly clean by, I say, running it at lower RPM and even a really low RPM during the afternoon. And as you can see, the cleaner is still running at a rate of knots, and all I did was I went and bought a really cheap pool cleaner and the kind of connector in the weir, which I'll show you. You can adjust the spring to allow it to work at different pressures, and that allows it to work quite comfortably, as you can see, at a lower pressure, at a lower pump pressure. So here we go in my weir. This is obviously where the pump is pulling through into the catchment basket. And on this little adapter over here, there you can see there's a little blue item over there, and that's where there's a spring where you can adjust the suction pressure. And by playing with the tension on that spring, I was able to adjust this so it runs at very low pressure from the pump itself. So here we go, here's the control unit for our pump. It allows you to set the RPM, so you can have set different programs. You can set it to run at different speeds at different times of the day. And at the moment it's kind of in its what is known as a filtration mode. It's drawing, you can see 228 watts, 1500 RPM. So really low power consumption instead of having a normal pump running at full tilt of like 750, 800 watts the whole day. And of course, as I talk about when considerations for replacing a normally electrically run geyser, we've got a solar geyser with 2 flat panel plates which keep it very hot. In this weather, that will easily hit 80, 90 degrees plus. And then it's got a tempering valve, and that tempering valve acts as a preservation for the hot water in the cylinder, basically a safety feature, but I'll explain that once we get down to the consumption figures. And here we go, just to give you some indication in terms of the temperature of our geyser at the moment, totally heated by the sun. Through the summer, it does not touch the element at all, so you use no electricity. But that's the kind of compromise. With a heat pump, you have to debate that obviously you will be using electricity, but an average amount through the year. Whether it's with a solar on the roof in South Africa, certainly, then for most of the summer you won't touch your electricity, but in winter you might be using a fair amount of your element to actually heat your water. Right, so let's have a chat about that kind of walk through the house where I showed you those bits and pieces. There are a few things, as I said, even during the chat I was having in the house there with the lighting, in terms of understanding, let's say with the LED lighting inside the kitchen, with those tubes, they use about 1/3 of the power that a normal fluorescent tube would use. So potentially a very good saving. The LED downlighters in the lounge potentially can use 1/10 or less of the power that a normal downlighter would use. But there potentially might be some lifestyle changes that you kind of don't, and compromises that you don't want to make. For instance, you may not like the color of the light from a downlighter or from the LED tubes. So you have to evaluate and see, can I say, right, I do want to put the LED downlighters in, but when I read a book, I want that nice incandescent globe, so I'll just have a side light. Another thing to note is that I worked out at the time when I went through the exercise of replacing the fluorescent tubes in our kitchen and the downlighters in the lounge, that it would take, at those rates back then, and that was over a year ago, the electricity cost then, it would take about 2 1/3 years to pay off the cost of the LED downlighters. And after that, I'd be making a saving. Now, I've already had one of those downlighters fail and not work. And human nature is, am I going to go all the way back from the place I got it from to go get it replaced? Maybe, but perhaps not. So the cost, unless you buy good quality, well-known, perhaps brand name, which you know has got a guarantee or can be easily replaced, that investment can soon be nullified if you're going to have those items fail. So I'd be wary about going to buy the cheapest cheap downlighters, which only they may claim that they last for 50,000 hours. They are talking about the actual LEDs. The LEDs aren't the part that generally fail. It's the electronics driving the LEDs because of the heat. And if they fail soon, you've lost the economy of saving in terms of that. So that's something to be wary of. Then, as I also noted when I was inside our kind of closet there, you need to think about that intelligently. If you've got a light which is on permanently for 5 hours plus, you can probably see that it's going to pay for itself in a reasonable amount of time. If for retail and office environments where they may have lighting on for 12 or 24 hours a day, that kind of lighting decision and change can pay for itself very quickly. But in a typical house, you may have a light sitting in the closet which are only on for 5 minutes, half an hour a day. It's probably not going to pay for itself and not be really a viable solution to change it. Unless, for instance, you may have to consider that if you are going totally off grid and you've got a bank of batteries where the power consumption is going to be chewed fairly quickly on the batteries, even though you've got a short duration of usage, that high power usage you may want to reduce. So that's something else to consider. Then certainly the pool pump, you'll have seen the benefits there. my old pool pump, even though it was rated at 750 watts, I know the bearings were starting to go, so there's more friction in the drive of the actual pool pump. It was using upwards of 800 to 900 watts because of that. So that's something you have to be wary of. That may be an item that you choose and say, well, you're going to wait till it fails before you replace it, because if you're going to pull out a good pump and to put in a more economical pump, it might not be viable at the time, but at least you know when you get the failure, replace it with something that is far more economical in terms of its electricity use. And you saw how well it still worked, driving the actual cleaner and what have you. Then the other item I want to talk about again was where I showed you our solar panels on the roof. So understanding the choice between going solar water heating or using a heat pump. For those of you that don't know, and I'll annotate here, I have a couple of videos on kind of solar panel, the tubes or the plates, and then also a heat pump installation that I did, and it was a very special type of heat pump. It had a proprietary preheating system. It was an ITS heat pump, and a heat pump basically uses refrigerant. It's like an air conditioner but working in reverse. So whereas if you have an air conditioner, you stand behind it, you get this hot air blowing out, but it cools internally. A heat pump does that in reverse. The byproduct is cold air, but it heats, and that heating effect is more efficient because it's using the ambient air temperature with the refrigerant to actually heat your water in your geyser. So it heats it far more efficiently than a heating element does. There are some things to note with that. Because it's just like an air conditioner working the other way around, it has working parts, it's got electronics, it's got a fan that works, it needs maintenance. You should maintain them at least once a year, get them serviced. So there is a service fee you have to be aware of and add into your costs in terms of working out whether it's a viable solution. In terms of the judgment call between going solar and heat pump, here in Cape Town, South Africa, I can probably easily go for 4 to 5 months without my element being switched on in my geyser, because we've got a lot of sunshine during summer. But obviously during winter, the element potentially is almost on. It certainly is assisted by the sun if it's out, but the element is switched on at 3000 watts or 2000 watts. The heat pump, on the other hand, it's using electricity during the summer, but it's obviously helped because the ambient air temperatures are higher. But on average through the year, apparently, through what people say, the average electricity usage on a heat pump is less than a solar geyser, because of that fact that during the winter you've got a far more efficient heating system than having that element switched on. So that's just something to note. The other thing I mentioned there was with a solar powered geyser, it can act like a storage battery. In summer in particular, you can have a few days of overcast weather, and if you've got a good efficient heating system which can take your water up to 70, 80, 90 degrees, if you have a thermostatic valve, that thermostatic valve, or tempering valve as they're sometimes known, it's actually installed, it's legislated here in South Africa as a safety requirement. It basically, you preset the heat of the water that can come out of it. It blends the hot water out of the geyser with the cold water from the municipality to give you, let's say, a temperature of 55 degrees Celsius. That is safe, so that in case if you had water at 80 or 90 degrees, a young child or an elderly person might scald themselves if they don't realize that when they just have the hot tap running. So it only allows that 55 degree water. The beauty of it is, if the water temperature in your geyser is sitting at 55 degrees and you're trying to run a hot bath, you've got the hot tap on fully, it's then obviously going to pull all the water from your geyser, all the hot water, because it needs that hot water at 55 degrees. If, however, your water is sitting at 65 degrees, it's going to pull slightly less hot water and start blending cold. If your water is sitting at 70 or 80 degrees or 90 degrees, it's going to pull far less, water, it's going to be blending more cold water to give you that 55-degree water coming out. And that means you start saving water in your geyser because it's at a higher temperature. So it's certainly something to note. In other countries, if it isn't legislated, look into installing a thermostatic valve or a tempering valve for that functionality. It really makes a big difference. Right, so let's now go back and look at the figures if you do make these changes in your house and get better appliances and potentially what you can save. Right, so let's just have a recap and remind ourselves of the daily consumption from this typical house that we worked out. Let's pretend it happens to be in summer. It was 22.7 kilowatt hours. So let's go look at potentially what you could save, and these really are real world figures. They certainly aren't trumped up in any way. The figures will obviously differ depending on the appliances that you buy and obviously where you live in the world and your climatic conditions. If you had to go and buy a more efficient fridge, you can go and see fridges these days, and most appliances have an eco or star rating. They have a rating to say how efficient they are, AA or AAA, and that means that they have got motors that run more efficiently. They also have better insulation, which means they don't have to switch on as frequently. So you've got a double saving there in terms of, let's say, the kind of low running power could be dropped to 25 watts. Its running power, when it's actually circulating refrigerant with a motor, could be dropped as low as like 80 watts. And then the duty cycle can be reduced because the insulation is better on a fridge like this, so it's kept colder. The cold air doesn't escape. So it might spend more time in the low power state, like 40% versus the 30 previously, and only 60% of the day in the higher power mode, which is already less. So based on that, without going into detail on the calculations, that would come down to 1,392 watt hours versus previously the 2,736. A TV, if you go to these new modern LCD TVs, so for an equivalent size TV, you could drop from 80 watts down to, let's say, 25 watts. And that would then bring you down to 125 watt hours. If we change those downlighters from the 50 watt downlighters to, let's say, 10 watt downlighters, now I'm being quite generous here because you could drop below that, but let's say you want some good lighting, so you don't want to go to a 5 watt LED, you're going to go 10 watt, still that's a fair saving. You're now going to be using 50 watts as opposed to 250 watts, so that goes to 350 watt hours. You may then decide to kind of kick out your old traditional geyser and go with the heat pump. And the power consumption of that may be 1,100 watts, but it's obviously far more efficient. It's also, generally speaking, they have timer systems on it, so you may only need to run it for 2.5 hours to get your water heated up. So there we go, move down to 2,750 watt hours. And as you can see, if we refer back to where we had 12,000 watt hours, that is a huge saving. And this is typically one area where you can make big savings on your daily energy consumption. And again, on the Eco Pool Pump, as you saw mine, as opposed to running constantly at 750 to 800, 900 watts for 7 hours a day, I run mine for about 450 watts for part of the day when the sun's out and I know I've got solar power. It then drops down to 220 odd watts. So I'm going to say, let's say we've got an average of 300 watts, and you might want to run it for longer hours because it's not pumping it as much water, it's at lower RPM, but generally speaking, it's more efficient for the power input. So you may not need to, I'm just doing this as a worst case. So that then equates to 3,000 watt hours. And let's say there are some items like your microwave, it's still going to consume 1200 watts and you're still going to cook for half an hour a day, so that's not going to change. But look here, so we then come down to 8,217 watt hours, and that equates to 8.2 kilowatt hours versus our 22.7. that we had previously. Now, as you can see, just that exercise in itself, besides readying yourself for solar power so that you don't have to have such a huge outlay on your solar power, just this exercise can halve your energy costs in terms of what you're paying for electricity. Not just only that, particularly in South Africa, we don't have in our domestic household energy charges, we don't have a time-based, but it's tiered. So if you are using more than, let's say, 400 or 600 kilowatt hours per month, your price per kilowatt hour increases. So if you can drop below a certain point, it doesn't just halve in price, your price per kilowatt hour then reduces. So you could seriously end up only paying like a third of your energy cost if you do drop. And that's where even having partial solar power, adding to your power requirement, can get you those lower rates on your energy per unit or per kilowatt hour. So certainly a lot of value to be gained there. I'll show you some of the devices that you can use. I'll also annotate, I have a link to some energy meters that I have shown before, some pros and cons, and I'll show you a few that you can obviously use quite easily to go through this exercise yourself. Right, so because I kind of did think I was going to go into the market, in fact one of the things I thought I might end up doing in my profession was to actually perform energy audits for people, but people just weren't prepared to kind of pay the money to do that. But so I invested in this Fluke 43B. You do get other types of meters in the Fluke line and by other manufacturers which do professional monitoring of the quality of power and you can work out power consumption. These devices are obviously expensive, so as a normal householder you wouldn't use them, but in an industrial bigger environments, these certainly is the kind of kit that you would actually go to do that kind of energy audit. The one item that has been very popular, particularly in the States, in fact this one I bought in the States, is the Kilowatt. You can simply plug it into an outlet and then plug an appliance into this to measure its power consumption over time. So relatively cheap, and it's the one way to kind of work out what something's using. Of course, this kind of thing, however, you're going to find very difficult to be able to implement this if you want to find out what your pool pump is using or your geyser. So what you can do there, and again, that video I told you about, you can buy the cheaper devices like an OWL or an Effigy. There's quite a few of them now. And those you need to actually clamp round the individual circuits in your DB board. So that gets a bit more tricky because you need to know what you're doing. You need to be qualified. I certainly don't recommend that you go open up your DB board unless you know what you're doing, because it's very dangerous. But a qualified person who would potentially come and do an audit on your house, that's what they could do, is go and put these current clamps or current taps around the individual circuits to measure what each of them are actually producing. Or, as I say, if you're going to get a rough idea yourself, you could do this with any appliances that you plug in and then relate back to your monthly electricity bill to see whether you're getting near the mark and make perhaps estimations or guesstimations on like your geyser. As I said, if you know the size of the element of your geyser and the amount of time it's on, you can make a fairly good approximation of what it's using. Right, so really hope you gain some value from that exercise. It may seem a little tedious, and I get quite a few people coming to me and emailing me and saying, well, how can they get into solar power and understand how to install the solar power and what solar panels to use and what have you. But these are essential basics that you need to do properly in order to get ready for the next phase. And that's once you've got these figures and you understand how to kind of conserve your power consumption and get the right figures, you can then go ahead and start sizing your array and sizing the solar power installation. So that's where we'll lead on from here. We'll start moving into now from those figures, understanding how big a solar array should I choose. Do I size it for summer or winter? What inverter? How do I size the inverter and perhaps a battery bank? We'll even then from there we'll move on into choosing what type of solar panels one should choose. Is it worthwhile having solar panels that track? or having solar panels that face in different directions. There's quite a few interesting bits and pieces which we now lead into. So again, I thank you very much for following this series. Do consider subscribing if you do want to follow the rest in this series, and I'll catch you very soon for the videos that follow. Cheers. This video is sponsored by tester.co.uk.